You know, first, I want to express our gratitude to Professor Jody Armour for opening his home to us. It's really an incredible space, an incredible room, so thank you for that. And I'll do a quick introduction, and then he's going to set the table for the panel discussion. Professor Armour earned his bachelor degree from Harvard, his law degree from UC Berkeley, and has served as a member of USC's faculty in the law school for almost 30 years. His expertise is integral to the roundtable discussion that we'll have tonight. And in addition to teaching, he's the author of books that delve into the relationship between racial justice, criminal justice, and the rule of law. Professor Armour?
Thank you. All right, thank you. This space is dedicated to the criminal justice kind of way we approach problems in this society. My dad was given 22 to 55 for possession, sale of marijuana, used that typewriter back there to type his way out of prison and prove his innocence. And so I think about a lot of these issues through a criminal justice lens. And I was talking to Kath about this. Yes, there you are. And, you know, hearing about how the criminal justice system is being brought to bear on this problem. We tried it when I was here, like I said, since 95, 2006, 7, 8, 9, Safe Cities Initiative. We decided to crack down on the down and out using a beefed up police force, hundreds of millions of dollars. The solution to the houselessness problem was that the people had inner deficiencies and they needed to be put on a 12-step program, sent to shelters, and essentially put on a 12-step program that would heal their inner brokenness. They lacked personal responsibility. The problem of houselessness isn't a lack of jobs or income or health care. It's a lack of people's moral fiber and personal responsibility. That was what Bratton was saying out loud and others who were behind the program, right? And then we saw what a horrible failure that was, how that intervention after it's just ballooned. So you would hope we would have learned something from that experience, but we haven't. Here we are again, going back to criminalizing the houseless, cracking down on the down and out as a way of poverty governance, as an approach to poverty governance, right? And so one thing I just want to mention, the kind of in the table setting way on that point is when you walk through Skid Row, you can't help but notice the demographics. Down, Out, and Under Arrest, Forrest Stewart's book, did the numbers on this. 75% in Skid Row itself of the residents are black. And when I go into the prisons, of course, I see the same demographics in San Quentin. The most miserable places that we have in our society have those demographics. And I, in my latest book and some of the research, started trying to understand why there's this empathy deficit when it comes to black folk in distress. Or if you put a black face on a problem, like houselessness, what that does to the general response to that issue. And the studies I found that I looked at mirror neurons and how our mirror neurons work and whether they fire when we look at out-group members. And they don't. The mirror neurons don't fire, meaning the basic building blocks of empathy, which mirror neurons provide, don't fire at an unconscious level. So when I tried to understand what happened in Hurricane Katrina, when you have the people standing on the rooftops with the water up to their necks, 1 day goes by, 2 days go by, 3 days go by, remember that? 4 days go by. You have Sean Penn, pictures of Sean Penn rolling up with fresh water, handing out. FEMA still hasn't gotten its act together 4 days in, right? Compare that response to the 9/11 response. And I was trying to say, well, what explains that lack of panic of empathy? And it is these studies on mirror neurons. So the final word I'll say on that is when you walk through Skid Row, you have the 9th Ward, Hurricane Katrina, with water up to the folks' necks, not for just 1, 2, 3, 4 days, but for 4 weeks, months, years on end. You know, the water's right up here, but we seem to have an empathy deficit as a society for their plight. What explains that, right, at a deep level that I hope we can explore some tonight. So that's it.
Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists, and then I'll let you know sort of the pattern for how the discussion is going to flow tonight. So our first panelist here is Kath Rodgers. So she's a staff attorney for the ACLU's Dignity for All project, where she works to advance the rights of unhoused community members. In her solo practice, Kath defends unhoused clients and activists. Importantly, she served as co-counsel on a federal constitutional class action lawsuit which challenged the criminalization of houselessness and resulted in a settlement to change discriminatory policing practices. Kath graduated from Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego and earned her bachelor's degree from UC San Diego. So this is Kath Rodgers. We also have Rick Corsini, a partner at Corsini Stark Architects. His professional work includes multifamily housing, urban infill, master planning, historic preservation, and adaptive reuse. Their recent design work has been honored by the LA chapter of the AIA, the LA Conservancy, Westside Urban Forum, and the LA Business Council. Rick was born in LA and earned his bachelor's in architecture from Cal Poly Pomona and his master's in architecture from Harvard. In addition to over 25 years of professional practice, Rick has been on the faculty of several schools of architecture and currently teaches at Cal Poly Pomona. So let's welcome Rick. Next we have Rae Wong. She is a senior organizer at Housing Now California. It's a coalition of groups who are building power to make housing more, get the mic back, housing more affordable and to combat displacement that disproportionately impacts communities of color. Rae is also a Presbyterian pastor and serves on the board of Creating Justice Los Angeles, an organization advancing economic justice in Skid Row. Rae earned her bachelor's degree from Boston College, a master's in divinity from Boston University, and also has a master's from Duke University. So let's give Rae a warm welcome. And Dr. Ryan Smith is also on the panel. He serves as the president and CEO of the St. Joseph Center, which is one of LA County's largest service providers for people experiencing homelessness. Prior to joining St. Joseph Center, Dr. Smith served as the Chief Strategy Officer for Community Coalition, an organization founded by Mayor Karen Bass. Before his time at Community Coalition, he served in leadership positions for several organizations focused on education and empowerment. Dr. Smith earned 3 degrees from UCLA, including his doctorate in education, and his commitment to civic engagement is underscored by his recent award from UCLA. He's the first ever recipient of their Excellence in Civic Engagement Award. So congratulations on that. And just really quickly about myself, my name is Sara Letts. I'm the moderator for the discussion tonight. I am the executive director of a nonprofit called Hollywood Community Housing. So what we do is we build affordable housing and we provide the services and we operate all of our buildings. We started in Hollywood, but they're now all over Los Angeles County. And we partner with organizations like St. Joseph Center. And a small coincidence is that there's a highly sought after award from Bank of America, and Dr. Smith and I just found out 2 days ago that we won. So we're the 2 representatives from the LA market who get the Neighborhood Builders Award from Los Angeles County. So we get to do some leadership training together in the coming year. So yes, I look forward to working with you in that capacity in the future. But we should get started with the panel discussion. So the format is this. We're going to talk about the problem. It took decades to get to the crisis situation we're in today. So I'm going to ask questions to prompt every panelist to sort of share their perspective, because I read their bios. You can tell there's a diverse range of perspectives that will sort of blend together to create a more whole picture of how we got into this housing crisis that is probably the most acute of any community in the country. And then we're going to talk about solutions that are working. Like, there is some traction to make things better. For the first time in 5 years, there was a slight dip when they did the point-in-time count in Los Angeles County, slight dip in the number of homeless households and individuals. But there's a lot more work to do. So the final component of our panel discussion tonight will be about what should we do? It's a call to action. There's a lot we can do. The election is coming up. There's ordinances coming before the Los Angeles City Council. There's really a lot to do to make sure that together we can advocate for a more progressive housing agenda locally and then also in the state of California. So with that, I am going to kick off the conversation about how do we get here. So I thought maybe we'd talk about, okay. Sharon is going to give you a signal if we're running over on time a little bit. And after each segment, we're going to reach out to the audience for Q&A. So we want to make sure that every 20 minutes or so that we're engaging with the group that's here, because we want to hear your thoughts and we want to address some of your questions. Okay, so Rick, we're going to start with you because land use, it's sort of fixed, right? And so there are decades, if not more than a century, of things that have been happening with regards to land use that have sort of calcified the situation, and it's making it really hard for us to affect positive change when it comes to addressing the housing crisis. So I'm going to hand you the mic, and if you could speak for a few moments about how we got here from a land use perspective.
Sounds great. So, I think that the land use issue, I think you have to go back. Actually, it's an interesting story, because if we look at the way land use has developed over the course of the last century and this century, we invented a few things that.
Speak right into the microphone. Close.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
You'll hear it when it picks up.
Is that okay? Yeah. Got it. So if we go back to the beginning of the 1900s, we didn't have a comprehensive zoning system that we have today, and zoning has become the primary land use tool that we in the United States use to organize our land and uses and et cetera. And one of the key things that has been our primary obstacle today is single-family zoning. Now, this idea of the American dream, a single-family house on a plot of land with that independence that we've seen, has become kind of a right that we all feel entitled to. But it wasn't always like that. R1 zoning was effectively invented here in the United States, in Berkeley of all places, around 1910, as a method for keeping black people out of new housing developments. So that core thing that was really developed by the real estate industry became the primary tool for exclusionary practice nationwide. So we can start, once this tool had been developed and became effective, it became nationalized with the FHA after World War II. And in fact, it was the National Realtors Association that actually advocated for this zoning practice with the FHA. So from that, you start to understand after World War II, we have, well, let's step back. We think about the Great Migration after the Civil War and the great migration of black people from the South to northern cities, and up through World War II, there was the phenomenon of white flight from our urban environments. That white flight phenomena after World War II was facilitated by our collective investments in the interstate highway system and our land use policies nationwide. So the idea of making the single-family home, the R1 zone, something that could be like a birthright for certain people in the United States became the primary land use pattern across the country. And the interesting thing about that as a tool for discrimination is that it's much easier to segregate a suburb in a low-density environment than it is in an urban neighborhood, right? A cosmopolitan neighborhood, a diverse neighborhood, because there's too much interdependence within a city, within an urban pattern like that. So that became the tool for what we're seeing at this point. So interstate highway system follows in the 50s. We have single-family zoning, and in this new suburban pattern after World War II, we have an influx of GIs coming back, and we have this explosive growth, low-density suburban growth. And then from that, we start to find the exclusionary practices are built into that system. So Levittown, right after World War II, they had exclusionary practices built into their deeds. This became kind of the way this whole system worked. When we come down to Los Angeles, we can realize that in, say, 1960, the zoning capacity of Los Angeles was for 10 million people, when the city only had a population of 2.5 million, right? Enormous capacity. What we've done since 1960 is effectively downzoned ourselves into a housing crisis, right? Today, or 2010, last comparison I was reading about, we had a zoning capacity of 4.3 million with a population of 4 million. In over 50 years, we reduced our zoning capacity. That means the number of people who could live in the city from 10 million to 4.3. In the same amount of time, our population doubled. So just that numerical thing can explain the phenomena that we're all grappling with. And you can understand that phenomenon as being really a product of a white flight and the zoning restrictions that we placed on this. And at the same time, our transportation system that allows that R1 zoning to function is also something that disaggregates is one of the other things that have disaggregated our cities. So the combination of that automobile dependence and the single-family zoning that is the pattern across the country has allowed us, has created the race equity crisis that we're dealing with. It's created the environmental crisis that we are dealing with. The carbon footprint of an American suburb and the consumption of an automobile is enormous. And we've exported that model to China and all over the world. So the model has been emulated and has created this. And then on top of that, we have the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis. So it all stems back to that core policy idea that has been developed as, the law of the land.
Thank you, Rick. So now we're going to get the perspective of a lawyer. So, Kath, when you think about how the housing crisis got to this point, what are some topics missing typically from the public discourse?
Well, I hope I never embodied the perspective of a lawyer, first of all. Well, I think this is a really helpful grounding, and I think it's really helpful that Rick kind of grounded us in regulatory, history and just kind of how we got here, and highlighted the historic racism that led us to where we are, because I think that is one of the core topics that's not talked about enough in the housing crisis, is that you can't talk about the housing crisis without talking about systemic racism, and you can't talk about it without talking about generations of disinvestment that are racially motivated. Today, Black families are evicted at much, much higher rates. Homeownership for Black families is much lower. And in LA County, the Black population is 8%, and yet I believe it's 34% of the unhoused population. And so you cannot talk about the housing crisis without talking about systemic racism. And this is because of the types of racist policies that Rick was talking about with in the regulatory frameworks that he was talking about, but also in every aspect of American policy and also every aspect of housing policy, from redlining to restrictive zoning to banking and lending policies to education to the criminal legal system. We know that one of the criminal legal system over-criminalizes Black community members and re-entry and when people are released from incarceration, that's another driver of houselessness. And so we cannot talk about this without talking about racism. As Rick mentioned, this is an affordability crisis, and that's why we see the concentration in the city of LA and the county of LA. And that is how housing affordability is a national crisis, and we're at the epicenter of it. And what I would add to Rick's historical narrative is adding the historical disinvestment, because we saw, to kind of go back to the history lesson, we saw in New Deal, we saw investments in public housing, right? And we saw that, that was not only seen as public housing for very low income folks, but also for middle income folks. Basically, there was a recognition that the private housing market is never going to meet our housing needs, because the private housing market is not, it's not in the business of housing everyone. It's in the business of making profit. And so that kind of commodification of housing in recent decades has really exacerbated that. Viewing our homes, when we see these media headlines about the increase in housing costs, or I'm sorry, the housing prices, when your home value shoots through the roof, it's not supposed to be that way. It's a human dwelling. It's not, but it's traded as a stock. And so when we commodify housing, that makes it so that not everyone can afford housing. How many of you have heard the musical chairs metaphor about housing affordability? By show of hands. Okay. This one is one of my favorites. So housing affordability can sort of be seen as a game of musical chairs. So imagine you have 10 friends who are playing a game of musical chairs. And the point of musical chairs is there's not enough chairs for everyone, right? So, the first round, there's 9 chairs. And one of your friends has a broken leg. And she can't go as fast around the circle, right? At the end of the game, when the music stops, she doesn't have a chair. But did her broken leg cause her to be chairless? No. There's 9 chairs, there's 10 people. At the end of the day, someone's not gonna have a chair. It's just that her vulnerability caused her to not have a chair. And similarly with the housing crisis, we do not have enough affordable housing for everyone. And so by design, people are going to live on the street because we don't have enough of it. That's a policy failure, and it's generations in the making, and we can fix it. And in the next section, we're going to talk about the solutions that work, because we actually do know what works, and the data is very clear about what works. It's just that we need to fund it, and we need the political will to fund it. Something else that I think is missing from the debate is some of the non-solutions. I think we, as Professor Armour was talking about, we kind of blame people for their own houselessness and their own condition. I think that's really harmful, and I think one of the symptoms of that Professor Armour was talking about is that we criminalize people for being unhoused, and that's a non-solution that's very, very expensive. And part of that is just trying to erase the problem, trying to make people invisible, because the most visible sign of our housing crisis is people living on the street. And what criminalization does is, sends police out in our communities to ticket people, arrest people, and that's very, very expensive, and that's resources that we're not investing in the solutions that work, which is what we'll get into in a few minutes.
So next we'll have Rae speak, because Rae, I think from your perspective, one of the points that Kath made about the business of making money off of housing, right? Treating it like a commodity when it's really something uniquely special. It's central to each person's well-being and their life. So what does your coalition believe are some of the major issues contributing to the housing crisis? The role of corporate America and the private sector and exploiting people, and could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, certainly. It's great to be part of a panel that's so smart because I don't have to do a lot of the work here. But exactly what Kath was saying, you know, the problem that we are encountering right now that our coalition believes is it's corporate greed that is really keeping us from being able to ensure that everybody has a home. One of the things that we actually fought for together with ACLU was a constitutional amendment that would make housing a human right, and we're hoping to bring that to the table again in the coming years. But that is in fact something that we need to understand and really comprehend to understand and comprehend housing as a public good. We see clean water as a public good. We've seen clean air as a public good. Housing is also a public good. Everybody needs a home to be able to survive. And so simply, if we act in a kind of system by which somebody's always going to lose out, where housing is made for profit, not actually for homes, for human beings, for people, then somebody's gonna lose. That person with the broken leg, I love that metaphor, by the way, is gonna lose out, and it's gonna be those who we have disenfranchised over the years from the very beginning of this country. And so what I think one of the things that we are together as a coalition working on is trying to come up with solutions to ensure that we begin to change that system, that we begin to change the motivation, and that we begin to pull away from that greed and really force and regulate our corporations to be accountable for what they are doing and how they're continuing to contribute to the crisis that we have.
Thank you, Rae. And so Ryan, looking back, so your organization provides services, and anybody who's experienced homelessness has experienced so much trauma. And so the services are truly essential. But in our country, we have a very long history of underfunding essential services. So could you talk a bit about that? So, you know, a lot of the people that you're working with today and our organization is housing today, you know, the lack of services over decades is created generational trauma. So if you could talk a little bit about the history of the underfunding of services that are really essential.
Sure, and I just want to say it's good to see everybody here today. And you know, we talk a lot about housing, and it feels like we depersonalize some of the issues that we see. So I appreciate you talking about trauma, but as somebody who started my career as a youth organizer, I think it's important to at least share my experience. So you know, I grew up in Los Angeles, and I was 15 when our family struggled and experienced homelessness ourselves. I'll never forget it because I was coming in from after school, and we're talking about particularly the disparities of black families. My mother spent her life savings to move from South LA to Culver City because she heard the schools were good, and worked hours upon hours so that we could stay in that home, and then that home that she had made for a decade. Unfortunately, we were told we had 10 hours to vacate. She handed me trash bags and said, we need to pack up everything. We were in our car, and my mother basically begged folks within the community to let us stay in their living room so that I could continue to go to high school. If it wasn't for my counselor, who convinced me to stay in high school, if it wasn't for my assistant principal who paid for my application to go to UCLA, I probably would not be here. So when we talk about services and continuum of care, this is real. When Professor Armour talks about the humanity of folks that we see in Skid Row, like that is real, particularly because they do look like me, and they look like many of us in the audience today. So services really do matter. And my history matters in the historic context too, because my mother always believed it was her individual failings. But no, she was a part of a system, particularly in Los Angeles, that not only divested from many communities and made it hard, as we've heard, to live, particularly as communities gentrified, particularly because of redlining, particularly because she couldn't find a loan to buy a home. But also because in Los Angeles, we know that, and now I'm a caretaker for her, she suffers from dementia, that we underfunded particularly supports for folks who are mentally ill. And we have never, ever really reinvested in those forms of care for folks who are experiencing mental illness. So much so that I know that if it wasn't for me and my mom's single son, single child, she'd be on the streets. We also know that historically we've underfunded the social safety net through the 70s, and that continued through the 80s. As we heard, we criminalized those folks who were experiencing homelessness. By 1984, Los Angeles was known as the capital of homelessness across the country. And we continue to make cuts in social services. I remember 2005, Governor Schwarzenegger's big cut. I remember 2011 when we saw once again Governor Brown make big cuts, and all of that had experiences to our social safety net where we've never been able to really fund and support services to the level they need to be. And we've never done a good job of prevention. And the only way we can end homelessness is actually funding prevention. Because there's no way we can only do work downstream if we're not talking about work upstream. So we need more resources, but particularly for folks who look like me and many disenfranchised folks, those resources have never been readily available, and we continue to fight for them. Hence the reason why we're fighting for things like Measure A today. Hopefully that's a good segue at some point. So, all right, thank you.
So I just want to reach out to the audience. So every panelist is sort of putting together the complicated set of circumstances that have led to where we are. So does anybody in the audience want to ask a question of one of our panelists? Here, I'll hand you the mic.
Well, it's simple.
Yes?
I just recently learned, well, in the last 2 years, what redlining is. I'm wondering if everybody in here knows what that term is and what it means.
And I will just, if I may add, redlining is still happening. In 2023, City National Bank was fined like, I forgot how many millions of dollars, $300 million, because they were redlining in 2023. I mean, it was shocking, but it's happening all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in all this, but I can say that from a land use standpoint, but redlining happens from the financial standpoint, but it happens with supermarkets. It happens with all sorts of businesses that are saying that this is why you don't have a grocery store in many in South LA, is that they've determined that this is not a safe place for our investment. That happens throughout the economy, and I'm sure we can all talk more about that, but.
Oh, yeah. Do you want to add something to it?
I mean, I think just, to add to what Rick said, I mean, the specific exclusionary zoning where people literally couldn't live in neighborhoods, could not receive, home loans in certain neighborhoods. And I mean, that was the red line on the map where people, could not own property and could not thrive. And those legacies are still very present today.
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember one of the first projects I worked on as an architect in an architect's office. I was looking at our client's deeds for this house in Pacific Palisades, and this is when I first became aware of redlining, as I was 24 years old, one of my first jobs, and it says from 1901 in Pacific Palisades, the owner shall not sell to a person of color, a Jewish person. It had a whole list of people that could not hold this deed. And I was like, my God, it was eye-opening as a young architect, this is what we're dealing with. And then you start to read more and understand just how pervasive the whole system was.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So I want to ping off what Jody said about the empathy deficit that we kind of all know about. I mean, that's why we allow this to go on year after year after year, because so many of the homeless don't look anything like us, and we can shepherd them into Skid Row and under the. So, are there any thoughts about any way that can be reversed?
The empathy deficit. said reversing
Well,
the empathy deficit.
I will say we don't talk about our unhoused siblings as our actual neighbors. Like the narrative around homelessness and houselessness in this city is so backwards. So much of the work that we're talking about now is about invisibilizing homelessness. As long as we don't see encampments, that means we've made progress. In fact, it's so interesting because Measure A, which we're going to talk more about, was polling higher until guess what happened? Not to be mean, Governor Newsom came in and did a press conference and moved some supermarket carts and said, we've cleared this encampment. And everyone said, well, why isn't LA doing that? And obviously, we've been making progress moving people inside in a way that they actually have homes and are moving to permanent supportive housing, but we're not talking about all the work that happens. It's not just about clearing encampments. That becomes a challenge. But I will say that the narrative around what's working is not happening. We're not talking about the 100,000 of people, or the 100,000 people that we actually housed through Measure H. We're not talking about the folks who are actually thriving because of the services that we have. We're not talking about all the units that have actually come online through HHH. All we hear about, nothing is working, but actually things are working. Do we need to focus more on prevention to make sure that the folks that we're housing, or that the inflow is actually not happening? Absolutely. Because the more we house folks, the more people are falling into homelessness because of our economic conditions. But things are working, and we should talk more about how we set narratives differently.
So we're going to take one question, and then we're going to move on to the next. I told this gentleman. And then we'll move on to the next section. There you go.
I just want to make clear, we're almost convoluting redlining and racial discriminatory deeds. Redlining started after World War II when the federal government drew a red line on maps and essentially said that certain groups of people, particularly black people, couldn't buy on the other side of the red line. And then it was adopted by other people. Racial discriminatory deeds was actually broken up by Lauren Miller, an attorney here in Los Angeles. And what he was able to do in the Supreme Court with Thurgood Marshall was to say that racial deed restrictions was unconstitutional and that they were unenforceable. But on many deeds, they're still there, but they're unenforceable.
Thank you. All right, so I feel like we're drifting into the next segment of the session, so I apologize to the couple people that wanted to ask questions, but raise your hand after this next group of questions, if you would. So we're going to talk about things that are working. So Ryan started to allude to some of the things that are working. So why don't we just go back to you, Ryan? So Measure H, quarter cent sales tax from 2017. It's been funding a lot of services. It's truly essential in LA County. So could you expand more on what is working? Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, Measure H has supported a lot of the homeless services that we see. We did see 100,000 people who received housing through Measure H, and I'll keep saying that. 100,000 people over the last 10 years received housing through Measure H. I think that deserves a round of applause because that's the work that we've done together. Now, unfortunately, we saw homelessness go up because as we've housed 100,000 folks fell into homelessness. And that is because of a lot of the economic conditions that we've seen. But we are building on that work, and that work continues to happen. I'll say because of that work, we see more permanent supportive housing, meaning as folks are moving from outside inside, they're receiving the types of intensive case management supports, caseworkers, wraparound services, programming necessary so that they're a part of a community when they come inside. Because it's not just housing first, it's housing first, but it's not just housing only. We need to make sure there is the community to ensure that people thrive when they're in housing. And we see that every day that's happening. I'll say for my organization, St. Joseph Center, we see folks just doing things differently because of that work. We were able to fund LVNs and nurses and community ambassadors and folks who are experiencing homelessness to go and meet people where they're at. In fact, we did a lot of the work on Oceanfront Walk to help people move from Venice Beach inside, and it's because of those services that we saw that 92% of the people that we engaged on the beach ended up getting permanent housing and stayed in permanent housing 2 years later, and that's because those were our resources and supports and action. So a lot is working. A lot has moved. We see a lot more affordable housing in Los Angeles because of Measure H.
Thank you, Ryan. And Rae, how about if you go next? So coalition building is really key. Could you talk about bringing together tenants, labor, other partners to help really move the dial for some of the solutions that are effective?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, earlier I had talked about corporate greed as being a problem of why we have a lack of housing and why we continue to have a housing crisis. Corporate greed is also participating in why we aren't paying enough wages to our workers. Corporate greed is also the reason why we can't afford our prescriptions. I mean, like, corporate greed is, if I can say, a common enemy amongst many of our sectors. And so there is actually has been a growing coalition building effort across many sectors, across the transformative justice sector to labor unions, to, of course, tenants, unhoused organizations, who have not always worked collectively together, but have been working together because of our common fight for affordable housing. Even across climate justice groups, we are all fighting to be able to ensure that our housing is healthy, that our housing is stable, our housing is sound. And when I speak with our labor union partners, a lot of them say that housing is actually one of the #1 priorities of their workers. That no matter how much money they make, they still can't make enough for how fast the costs are rising for their rents. And so this is a way by which we have been working actively together. And I want to talk a little bit about the solutions, because the reality is we have been making a difference. We have been housing people. We have been coming up with new ways to ensure to combat the villain, if you will, the opposition. However, one of the systems, I do want to name another problem, even before we move into solutions, is that no matter how much affordable housing we build, the problem is that our affordable, and I want to get into the weeds a little bit, I hope you can bear with me, that one of the challenges we face is that the affordable housing system that we currently have relies on the profit-making system. Our affordable housing developers, or shall I say just regular developers, whether or not they care about affordable housing, rely on low-income housing credits, LIHTC for short, to be able to get the funding to ensure that they don't lose money, so that way they basically get money from the government to be able to build housing as long as they ensure that a certain percentage of the housing they're providing is going to be affordable. One of the issues, though, is that it has an expiring covenant. After 20, 25 years, in our state 55 years, it is no longer affordable. So no matter, even if we get 100,000 people housed, then we have another 100,000 people who no longer have housing. And we have other, and you can go into the details of loopholes in laws that are causing more of our housing being lost, affordable housing being lost. But I want to name that because this is one of the solutions we have, and I'll finish quickly. One of the solutions we have is to begin to change the housing system. One where we remove housing off the speculative market and into community hands. And I'll talk about this a little later because I'm losing time, but anyway, I'll give you a little teaser.
Thank you, Rae. So Rick, supply. She's talking about supply to some degree. So in LA, adaptive reuse, upzoning, are there any sort of solutions that are getting traction in the city of LA?
I would say yes. That's good timing. I mean, right now, I'll say that the housing element of the city planning department produced 2 years ago now was probably one of the most progressive documents I've seen in my career coming out of the city of Los Angeles. It was one of those documents that, you know, when I read through it, it's like every point was on point, and I didn't disagree with any of it. And it was one of those things from changing, being aggressive about reducing or eliminating R1 zoning, having tenant protections built into the housing ordinances, upzoning throughout the city that would allow us to increase our capacity to where it needs to be, placing emphasis on the transportation interface between increased density, the idea of reallocating or creating incentives to spread the affordable housing and permanent supportive housing citywide and not just in the poorer neighborhoods of the city where they tend to be because property values are lower. The idea of distributing them in high value districts was critical, and they were very aggressive in that, and those the policy directives with this. It was a very powerful document. And as we all started looking at it in great detail, we realized this is something that really needs to be supported by civic leaders, community leaders, recognizing how powerful it was. Since then, since it was originally adopted by the City Council, it's been going through kind of the sausage mill of revisions. And right now, one of the key provisions of that housing element, which is the citywide housing incentive program, they call it the CHIP ordinance, was very powerful, and it's been watered down, unfortunately. So they've taken the R1 zoning application out of the CHIP ordinance, and most of us are just dismayed by this. But it's something that's from an advocacy standpoint that we have to find a way to bring it back, because it is the core issue that has been causing this problem that we're facing, and we need to address that core issue. But many other things about it in terms of allowing greater density, mixed uses along our transit corridors, about creating incentives for developers, private for and nonprofits, to be building in those high opportunity zones where there's greater access to resources. That's still very robust. I think these are the things that are looking very, very good, and it also sets up an advocacy platform for us to push for the pieces that have been pulled out of this ordinance. And I'll also say at the same time, that's at the City of Los Angeles level. The state has been doing amazing things with new policies about Senate Bill 9, SB 9 has allowed for the subdivision of R1 zoning into multiple use developments. We're looking at AB 2097, which allows developers to reduce the amount of parking on developments, which is one of the major cost drivers of construction of all kinds, but in particular for housing. And it allows that kind of flexibility to right-size that. So that's a very powerful tool, and there are many others. But there's a lot of great minds right now in Sacramento and in the city who are doing the right thing. And it's really about us finding the political will to enable that, to bring it into law.
Thank you. So, Kath, curious your perspective on some solutions. And anti-displacement, I mean, it is kind of shocking that we're housing so many people, and then I think it's more than 50% of the people who are newly unhoused are unhoused for economic reasons. So there are so many people becoming unhoused for the first time. So solutions you know of, and just to pick up on some of the discussion here about anti-displacement, is there any progress in terms of laws to mitigate people being forced out of their homes?
Yeah, well, I think those are great questions. I think our panelists have touched on some of them. I think we've heard about some of the things that are working in terms of ending people's houselessness, because what Dr. Smith was talking about is that we have solutions in LA that are working, but we don't have them at scale. And also we need to focus on prevention so that we're not having more folks becoming unhoused every day in LA than we're housing. So we need to focus on two things. One is ending houselessness for folks, and the other one is prevention. We know what works to end people's houselessness. The data is very clear on this. There's two things. Housing subsidies, you make housing affordable for people, which is, housing affordability, you're not paying any more than 30% of your income for utilities plus rent, and providing subsidies. That is as close of a thing as we have to a silver bullet to end someone's houselessness. You give people the money they need to subsidize their housing. The government provides that. Right now it's a lottery system. Our Section 8 and our housing choice vouchers are not perfect, and there's a lot of source of income discrimination. We saw in the LA Times one of the biggest civil rights complaints filed by ACLU today against source of income discrimination. So it's a big problem, and it's not perfect, but we need housing subsidies to make it affordable. The other thing is housing first. It works. There's decades of empirical research that shows that it works. We need to meet people where they're at and provide housing as a first step and meet people's, that's the first step, and then we can provide supports. It's not the only step, as Dr. Smith mentioned. It's not housing only, but housing first, and then provide supports for people who need it in the scale that they need it too. Not everyone needs the same level of support. I have some clients who need a lot of support when they get into housing, and some people need kind of modest supports when they get into housing. So you have to kind of take people where they're at. And then in terms of preventing houselessness, we know what works for that too. A lot of the regulatory issues that Rick is touching on are housing or prevention strategies, but also eviction protections. We need to provide representation for folks in eviction proceedings. Not everyone who's evicted will become unhoused, but many do. Many folks end up on the street. That's, eviction is one of the driving causes of houselessness. And when people are represented by counsel, it prevents so many evictions. The data is very clear on that. Tenant protections, eviction protections, combating source of income discrimination like today's lawsuit talked about, and then also some of the things that Rae talked about, because it's not only a factor of housing affordability, but it's also income, right? So we need to increase people's ability to collectively bargain for their own wages, support unions, and support policies that will put more money in workers' pockets. So we need all of those things, but fundamentally it comes down to two things: ending houselessness for people and then preventing it. And we know how to do both. It's just a matter of doing it.
Thank you. All right, so, questions. So I'll hand you the mic.
Okay, so how do you shift the culture of what affordable housing is? Because I'm going to go back to like the 30s, and Elizabeth Wood, who was the first head of the CHA in Chicago, she wanted to do integrated public housing, put people scattered sites, not have them clustered and isolated. She got a lot of pushback on there. There were actually race riots over it. Finally, she was fired in 1954, and you had this model where you had all these high rises going up, sort of like warehousing people, and that is the model that people see as affordable housing. So how do you change the culture of that? Because that's where a lot of the problem comes from, is people want to say affordable housing is Cabrini Green.
I go to a lot of community meetings. You're absolutely right. The stigma from decades ago, but when you look at affordable housing today, it's quality housing with services. It's a totally different thing. But the stigma is so hard to overcome. I'll get to you next. But I thought I'd ask Rae, as an organizer, do you have any thoughts on how do we talk to more people to overcome the stigma from, or Kath, do you want to answer it? I'm not, either way. Okay, you both take it.
So I've been here, a number of questions has been related to narrative work, right? How do we flip the script? And I think that public housing has a bad name. It's developed a bad name, and it's primarily because we have disinvested it so much, and also because of the racialized way that we think about public housing has contributed to the way that we now envision, what could be a solution and what is a solution. I'm happy to say that there's been a growing movement to really redefine and take back public housing as a real social good. It worked for us when it was working, when we invested in it, and when we disinvested in it. Of course, it's not going to work because you got to keep up your buildings. You got to make sure that your air conditioning is up to snuff. You got to make sure that your buildings are up to code to ensure the safety of people, and you got to ensure that the resources are being provided for the management and services. And so right now, we are talking about social housing. Actually, I have booklets in the back for you all to take home, and also we have an online version if you're interested. Earlier this year, my coalition with many other partners across the country published a report on social housing campaigns across the country. What is social housing? Social housing is housing permanently off the speculative market so that it's co-owned in cooperatives, community land trusts. Public housing is a form of social housing. So that means it's housing off the speculative market, owned by a community, either a mission-driven nonprofit or the public, and it's also resident managed and resident controlled. And what that ensures is that there is constant management assurances that it's going to be a community caring for the land. It's going to be community land, so it's always going to be for the neighbors, and it's going to be permanently affordable because you're not buying and selling and raising the cost every single time you do that. And so public housing, we are trying to reclaim this new understanding of it. I will tell you that people don't like the term public housing. They immediately think of this racialized, classist understanding. But the way that we flip the script is by telling our story. The way that we were asked earlier about how do you change our understanding of unhoused friends, it's by telling our story. The fact that, my brother here has lived a life where he had to experience homelessness, not out of their own, where it was out of their control. Right? And yet we see a wonderful social justice warrior who's just won many awards. And we say, well, he can't be homeless. Well, actually, the reality is all of us are probably a lot closer to homelessness than we are to being a millionaire. Let's be honest, right? And so when we take that into account, we begin to tell our stories and begin to join in solidarity with, I actually can resonate with that story. And we begin to tell those stories. That's when we begin to flip the script. That's when we begin to reclaim things that need to be reclaimed, and we begin to liberate ourselves from these stories that no longer need to define us.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot to add to that. I think you kind of nailed it, Rae. I think the question is a good one. I mean, the racialized segregation of public housing was a product of history, like you said, and that it was explicitly segregated. And then we saw communities like Cabrini Green, which I actually grew up a couple blocks away from Cabrini Green in Chicago. And that was the narrative, right? In the 1980s, when there was this massive disinvestment, that was the narrative, was, this blighted, urban slums was the narrative. And that's, that fueled the racist, kind of rhetoric around disinvestment. And that's what caused the disinvestment in public housing. So, certainly public housing was not perfect. And like Rae said, it's about, building quality public housing and maybe rebranding, like you said. That's why we're talking about social housing, and we're talking about, really kind of this reframing and rebranding that is so important for the narrative work that needs to be done.
Did you have something?
I should add just a note on that.
Okay.
As the architect in the room.
Yeah. And did you also want to say something? Yeah.
So I'll have to say, to follow up on what you're both saying is, right on. But design also has something to do with all this, and the perception of the image of public housing. And in so many ways, the failures of the 60s and 70s public housing has to do with the image that went along with that disinvestment. And the idea, the image of slabs of brick housing buildings repeated ad infinitum, and with no kind of what we would say kind of an urban connective tissue between them, no parks, no lively streets, no stores, nothing that would actually create some civic identity for those neighborhoods. They were really more of a collection of so many square feet and so many housing units in the same way that you would commodify anything. They were built that way bureaucratically, right, without that core value system. So the important thing is to really be conceiving of all of this, public housing, affordable housing, how about neighborhoods in general, that have an automatic kind of understanding that it's not just that buying and selling of a particular unit or X number of bedrooms and all this. It's actually about how you design space that allows the community to come together and to live out their lives in the narratives of daily life. And I think that's something that is not commonly understood in kind of the bureaucratic world.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, I think actually the way people are thinking about affordable housing is actually changing. I actually think our economic condition, like when we're on the phones and talking to people about this measure, the thing that's resonating the most is affordable housing, because our economic conditions have shifted so much that a lot of folks are asking, how can I be a part of affordable housing? Because people who never, ever have experienced housing insecurity or experiencing housing insecurity, a lot of folks are saying, I am 3 paychecks away. If there were 3 paychecks that were gone, I would be experiencing what I see unhoused folks are experiencing. So I actually think we have more support than we've ever had for ideas around affordable housing. Now, there are folks who don't want black people to live in their neighborhoods, and that is historic. And I don't know if, I'm not going to convince racists that, not to be my neighbor. But I think we can convince the masses that affordable housing works and that we can actually invest in social housing. We can actually ensure that there's equity as far as where we're building affordable housing. Like, that is something we can do. But so in my job, I talk to a lot of people who maybe you would consider NIMBYs, who are like, I don't want this shelter here, I don't want affordable housing here, and I've decided that I'm not spending my energy there. I'm gonna spend my energy on the 90% of people who are actually really excited about what we can do differently about housing. So.
Thank you. Yeah. We'll take one more question, and then we'll go to the third. Yeah, you raised your hand before. Here you go. And then I'll get to you guys. If you don't mind, we'll do the other section, and then we'll get to you guys.
I'm not so sure this is a question, it's a statement, and I welcome anyone to weigh in on it, because when I look at what I see and I have seen, first of all, I lived in public housing in New York City in the Bronx, and the single largest housing project in the Bronx, Eden Wall Projects, and I lived there for 12 years. So during the late 50s, all throughout the 60s and the early 70s, that's where I lived. And I watched this slow deterioration of a community that at one time was supported financially by the city, and then they just kind of just stopped, and it got to the point where the elevators kind of stopped working and you had to use the stairs. Having said that, while I was watching that deterioration, I was also watching all of the white people, the Jewish families, the Irish families move out. And by the time that we left, it was just about, I'd say 75% black and 25% Puerto Rican. So what I see is a reflection of what our society feels is socially acceptable. There was a time when we had state-sanctioned, state-imposed and enforced segregation, and of course we don't have that anymore. But we still have the same segregation because we all accept it. And I don't know if there's anybody here that wants to weigh in on how we can get to that upstream problem. Because until we get to solving that upstream problem, we're going to continue to see it pop its ugly head up like the whack-a-mole. So if anybody can weigh in on that, I appreciate it.
I'd love to answer that question. What we often forget in our history books and in our classrooms is that the early movements that have brought us, fair wages, weekends, the labor movement, was actually built on a very diverse group of people, of workers who came together. You know, I can't remember the particular location in our country, but there was a number of workers who were working collaboratively together to be able to fight for basic rights as workers, so that way they could not die while they were working in the coal mines. And these were Black folks and white Russian folks and Irish folks and people who are speaking all different languages, and they gathered together to be able to fight for what they needed because they had a commonality. There's a great book called When the Irish Were Black. I highly recommend that book, and that's an understanding the fact that, you know, we are constantly in our movement divided to be able to fight for the crumbs. We are just, you know, you've got a little crumb here, and we're all just fighting each other, instead of the fact that actually when we collaborate and collectively build that power, we can win so much more. You had asked the question earlier, Sarah, about the power of coalition work, the power of building across sector, the power of building across all of our various communities, across region, across our language, and the power that we can build. And that's exactly why we need to continue to fight, that when we say Black Lives Matter, and why that was such an important rallying call for so many of us in the movement, is because we understand that when we will not be free until Black people are free, and Black people will not be free until we are free. Like, we are bound together. There's a rabbi, I'm a pastor, I preach, I'm sorry. But there's a wonderful rabbi, Rabbi Aryeh Cohen, who often says, my struggle is your struggle, and your struggle is my struggle. My liberation is your liberation, and your liberation is my liberation. And that is the basic understanding of how we can actually build that kind of movement, and we have to keep that grounded into our souls and into our bones.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. So I know there's a couple hands up over there. So I think what I'm going to do is we're going to go to like the third section, which is really a call to action. So we're going to go big picture, state level first, but maybe our panelists could be concise, because there's some richness, I think, in the discussion that we're having from the questions from the audience. So let's do state level first. And so if Rae, if you could talk about propositions 33 and 5, that would be great. And county level would be measure A, and then city would be, what are we going to do to convince the powers that be that we need to upzone and we need more density on R1, et cetera. And I should look, Kath, what did we have? Oh, we want to hear more about the action items for the ACLU SoCal work from you, the kind of thing we can do even after the election. Okay, so Rae, do you mind going first?
Happy to. Okay, so I like to teach. So we talked about, right, the various solutions to our housing crisis. So we've talked about tenant protections, right? We've talked about zoning and regulation, and we've talked about reducing the power of our investors, and we've talked about public investment and being able to build affordable housing. So I just want to name those things to remind us, again, what we're trying to accomplish. And so how do they factor into what we can do right now? There's a number of things on the ballot this fall, but I'm only going to talk about 2 statewide ballot initiatives, and that is Prop 33, which is the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. When we talk about tenant protections, strong tenant protections, we're talking about being able to undo the racist corporate greed of deciding back in the 70s, now I've got to go back 2 minutes, in the 90s, sorry, there was a law that was passed called Costa-Hawkins, and this prohibited the ability to be able to allow for for new buildings to have rent control, as well as localities to be able to pass rent control laws. And so that has prevented, if you remember or may not remember, we did have enough housing for a time. And then we noticed recently, over the last few decades, that we've lost and lost and lost. Now we're missing a chair from our game of, not Ring Around the Rosie, musical chairs, right? And so we need to be able to gain that chair back. And so a way to do that is ensure that we have strong rent control laws in our city, in our state. A lot of folks are often misinformed in that they believe that rent control results in the landlord's inability to be able to, sustain being a landlord. That is actually inaccurate. When rent control laws just means that the rent does go up, but it goes up at a minimum, so that way it goes up with inflation. So it's still going to go up, but you're ensuring that communities can actually stay housed. It is a common sense law in the sense that we are just making sure that rents don't skyrocket to an ability that we cannot afford. Right now, we have a rent cap in the state of 10%. I don't know about you, but I don't make 10% more money every year. So if my rent goes up even 10%, even though that's a rent cap, I can't make it. So it is so important for us to be able to repeal this law that has prevented us from being able to have this common sense law of rent control in our state. So that is Prop 33. And then now I've talked about protections. Let's talk about affordable housing development. Prop 5 is another another proposition that is on the ballot, this November, and that will give local voters more power to address our affordable housing crisis. What it does is that right now you need to have 2/3 of a vote to be able to pass a local bond for infrastructure needs. So that could be streets, that is also housing, that is emergency and fire response. But what we need, but to be able to, 2/3 is a pretty high vote and oftentimes difficult to pass. And so what we need is actually to make it easier for localities to be able to pass bonds faster, so that way we can ensure that we're getting the funding we need to ensure that we can pay for the infrastructure that we need for our communities. And so that's going to change the voting requirements from 2/3 to a 55% pass, so that way we can ensure that we can quickly get the funding forwarded into the infrastructure that we need for our communities. And so what it also includes is accountability through ensuring that that funding is only for, so if you're passing a local bond, that's only for your locality. And so those funds are only, the funds that our taxes are going towards, or whatever the bond is, that's going to actually stay within your own local jurisdiction, as well as if there's any debt, that's also staying within that local jurisdiction, to ensure that it's going to be, there's accountability and authority by your local citizens to ensure what it is that they need and they want for their infrastructure needs and for our housing. So that's Prop 5. So those are two very important propositions that will be on the ballot this fall. So yes on 33. Everyone say yes on 33. Yes on 33. And yes on Prop 5. Yes on Prop 5. All right.
Now Measure A.
Yes. By the way, I want to go to one of your messages. I can imagine you have an amazing sermon. So you've been preaching all night. So just really quickly, just on Measure A. So Measure A is on the ballot for LA County. It is a 0.5-cent sales tax. I will say, even though we talk about it as a 0.5-cent sales tax, it's only a 1/4-cent increase because it builds on Measure H, which people are already providing a 1/4 cent. So it's only a 1/4 cent increase to support some of the homelessness work as well as the housing work. I like to say A stands for affordability. So when we talk about prevention, when we talk about protection, we talk about preservation, that's in Measure A. It does not sunset, so we do not need to vote for it in another 10 years, and that's really important because as we continue to end homelessness, we're going to be talking about wealth generation, all the other things that can happen with this funding that can be really powerful. A couple things that are going to be really important for Measure A. One, we talked about in order to end homelessness, we need to prevent it. Right now, only 3% of Measure H funds go to prevention. Only 3%. We know that that is not enough given all the things we've talked about today. So this will more than quadruple the amount of money that we're spending on prevention in order to support folks not falling into homelessness, which is really important and vital. A lot of folks are resonating with accountability language. So A stands for accountability as well. There's a couple things. One, we're not talking about the type of punitive accountability. We're talking about the accountability where there are clear metrics that that are set. There are clear goals that are set that we're all agreed upon. And the great thing is that this creates a table. We always talk about governance, but this creates a table where the mayor of Los Angeles, the counties, as well as the local municipalities will come together to actually agree on how we move forward. So it sets a table so that so that all the folks in power are having a discussion about how we're actually spending these dollars, and also the accountability necessary to make sure that this money is going to what it's meant to go to. Even accountability for folks like me, who are service providers, was really important. I talked about my mother who suffers from mental health challenges. This actually funds mental health supports. As we've talked about historic divestment from mental health, this actually gets us close to where we need to be in funding folks who are suffering from mental health, as well as folks who may be suffering from substance abuse addictions as well. And those things are really powerful in our fight to end and address homelessness. The last thing I'll just say about Measure A that's really powerful is, and Rae has brought this up, I've heard it from Kath as well, unfortunately the way that many of our contracts as homeless service providers are constructed, we cannot pay our homeless service providers what they need to be paid. This actually, for the first time, has labor standards written into Measure A so that folks who are helping to end homelessness are not suffering and one paycheck away from homelessness themselves. And that is really powerful. As we've heard, there's been a lot of state legislation that's been supported by labor, like AB 2011, that moves a lot of some of our work locally, as well as the work to increase affordable housing on faith lands. We've seen labor come to the table, but we need to ensure that we're paying people a living wage who are doing this work. And the majority of these folks, we run an organization where we have 400 staff who are doing all the work across LA County. 50% of that staff are Black, 20% identify as Latinx. The majority of that staff are women. So we're talking about Black and brown women who are ending homelessness. They need to be paid for the caretaking, life-saving work that they're doing every day. So really exciting. Can we say yes on Measure A? Yes on Measure A? Hey.
Rick, what can we do in the city?
Well, in the city, we don't really have something to vote on at this point, but what's happening right now in the city council is the planning commission 2 weeks ago had voted on the CHIP ordinance, which is the citywide housing incentive program. This is the major piece of that new housing elements that the city has put together. And the CHIP ordinance is something that has been watered down, and we'll talk briefly about what we can do to strengthen it up a bit, right? Which I think we all need to do. But even in its current form, it is now going before the Planning and Land Use Committee of the City Council, and then we'll go on to the full City Council and then to the mayor. That's the steps. The important thing is that it doesn't get watered down any further through that process, and that we then can advocate for the things that have been removed. The important thing about the CHIP is that it's basically a rezoning for the city for an additional 250,000 units. So it's a huge change in the way the city has been operating. And within that, we were just talking this afternoon about what it meant to take the R1 out of that component, and a little back of the envelope calculations on Zoom today with all of my cohorts. We estimated that R1 component could represent as many as 200,000 units, just from the removal of the R1 component from the CHIP ordinance. So we are all trying to figure out how do we start to create advocacy to bring that back, because we desperately need it. And just a little bit of background on it. The city of Los Angeles has 72% of its land is zoned for single-family housing. So you think about how are we going to, by state mandate, in the next 8 years, we need to find housing for 450,000 new units. And the current zoning is only allows 230,000. thus necessitating this upzoning for 250. But the reality is, these are all just best estimates, right? You can't really achieve 250,000 without overshooting considerably. And at this point, from what we're seeing, there's no excess capacity in that calculation. So the R1 is essential to meeting those state mandated goals. So I think the important thing now is that what the chip will do is it's got several components to it. It's going to incentivize development around transit. It's going to help shift the development of affordable housing to those high value neighborhoods throughout the city. It's going to redistribute it in that way, and it's going to focus development on those high density corridors. So that's key. So we're hoping that we'll be able to create, soon we'll create kind of an advocacy platform that will be able to say, here are the asks. We want everybody to call up their city council members, put a call into the mayor, go to your neighborhood councils, and let's find a coalition to help bring back these pieces that have been pulled out of the CHIP ordinance.
Thank you, Rick.
All right, well, we have a lot of solutions to get involved in, and we'd love for folks to get involved in ACLU SoCal's advocacy too. We have an activist engagement development team where folks can get involved as activists in a lot of the ballot measures that we've talked about. At ACLU SoCal, we view our housing justice work as two sides of the same coin. One is fighting for the human right to housing for everyone, and what that means is we actually believe that one day there will be a constitutional amendment for a right to housing, and we're pushing for that, as Rae mentioned. But a big part of that too is budget advocacy. Today we were at the LA County Board of Supervisors alongside our partners advocating for divesting from things that don't work, like the Sheriff's Host Team program, which is a response to houselessness that does not work and actually puts people in danger, and advocating for funding for things that do work, which is housing first and affordable housing. So budget advocacy is a huge piece of that, and narrative change is another big part of that. The other side of the coin is fighting back against the criminalization of poverty that doesn't work, because we know it doesn't work. And so we litigate against that. We just settled a big case, Tyson versus the city of San Bernardino, which was about criminalization of houselessness. And so we litigate against it, and we also advocate against it on a policy level. And I have to mention one policy that hasn't already been mentioned, which is Prop 36. We need to vote no on Prop 36, because that will cause increased investment in the criminal legal system, the biggest investment we've seen in jails and incarceration and criminalization of people of color, and that will put us in the wrong direction, and that is something that we need to vote no on. So those are two sides of the same coin, and we have a lot of opportunities to get involved in ACLU SoCal's activist network. So we would love to work with you all. And one thing that we can all do is vote on November 5th and engage all of our friends and family and get them out to vote as well.
Thank you. So I see 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands. Okay. So I think you'll go first, second, third, fourth. Vinny? Okay.
Hello, my son and I, we don't live in Los Angeles County. We live in Ventura County, and to be exact, Thousand Oaks, which is considered affluent, predominantly white. And what hasn't come up is your elected officials. For us, our elected officials are the problem. We just did redistricting last year, and there's 2 races, 2 district races. One race, a candidate has raised over $66,000. It's probably more by now, because he's taking developer money. The other race is a candidate. She's running for the first time against a troubling man that demeans people of color. And, you know, he doesn't need to be. None of these city council members need to be on the board, because what they do, they're in the pocket of developers. High-rise apartments go up, they're expensive. We're experiencing an issue, not just people homeless people, but there are educators that can't afford to pay their rent, and they go to nonprofits to get their rent paid. They have to make a decision, am I going to pay my electricity bill or my rent? And I think that the issue that hasn't been discussed is our elected officials. We have to get elected officials elected. I don't care if it's in LA County, Ventura County, whatever county it is in California, that have lived experience, which opponent candidate we are supporting does in the district that is mostly Latino and underrepresented people. And that is a problem. You have these elected officials taking developer money and these high-rise apartments going up, and they're not being rented. And I mean, how do you address that issue? Because that hasn't been addressed. I think the elected officials are a big problem, and you need the right people in there to represent everybody. So.
I totally agree, and I want to also ask our co-panelists as well, but I think you absolutely nailed it. I think one thing that we haven't really discussed is the fact that none of this is going to change unless we change who's in power, but also the people, the power of people, right? Because we're the ones who elect the people who are at the top. And so I think until we build movements that are powerful enough to elect the right people into office, we're not going to see the types of change. And so I think that's really at the core of it is supporting movements that are led by impacted folks and having real organizing. And that's, we have a real organizer on this panel who does that work. And I think that's exactly what it is movement building so that we have the power to unseat elected officials who are taking corporate money.
Thank you. So we're going to 3 more questions. So here.
Hello. Okay. I'm Lincoln. I'm actually one of Professor Armour's former students, I guess. And I was wondering about, because I'm really thinking about like politics, because I think politics is the solution, like for better or worse. Like you're not going to relieve your way out of this, and like stuff like that. I really liked what you said about like sort of shifting the narrative. And I'm wondering, how can we make housing into an issue that's pitched toward like helping everyone rather than what's going to help those other people? Because I think like if you look at the political movements in America that have been durable, the New Deal is very durable because like FDR was like, oh, I'll help you with all this stuff, right? And then he helped the people with the stuff, and then the people liked it, so they voted for him again. And like I think that's kind of how things work. ACA is unkillable, I think, or I think it's unkillable anyway, because so many people see the benefits like in their lives, right? They're like, I'd be dead without Obamacare, so that's why I support it, right? So what are ways we can shift the narrative from like relief, like, oh, this is a solution to help other people, to doing that thing you said where it's like, this is going to help your rent, when people are like rent secure, saying this is going to help your housing more affordable? Like, what are ways we can like shift the conversation towards doing that instead of like a more sort of like a relief minded like way of thinking about it?
Well, a couple things. I mean, I've been really inspired by the panel discussion. So, we've heard all 3 of our panelists talk about the power of people. And I think, it's rooms like this, there's communities like this where we're actually sharing our stories about how our work is actually connected to housing. What we're experiencing in our everyday, I think, is really important and powerful too. So how are we creating space to tell our stories? There's so many of us who are struggling on whether it's housing insecurity or food insecurity. We have a pantry, and we run the largest pantry on the West Side, and we see more people on fixed incomes, particularly our population that's aging, that's really deciding, can I pay rent or can I eat? And never have they ever experienced that before. Like, those are the stories we need to share together. So as Rae said, telling our stories are really powerful. By the way, the family that votes together stays together. So it's good to see a mom and a son really put, telling the truth. So power, I salute you all. for coming together as a family. That inspired me today as well. But we need to make space so that we are definitely telling our stories. Number two, we need to challenge the meta narrative around housing. When you look at the LA Times, or we look at some of our media, it is just deficit stories about unhoused people. If we want to talk, it's stories about walking through Skid Row as if it's not people who are actually our neighbors. So how do we do something different as far as interrogating the meta-narrative? And the really great opportunity to interrogate the meta-narrative is the Olympics, because the world stage is going to be looking at us, and they're going to be looking about how we deal with this issue. I mean, we could do like Paris, where they actually bust everybody into 10 cities outside of Paris to do the Olympics, or we can say we will do something different, the LA way, where it's not just what we do, it's how we do it. It's about how we house people, right? So we have the opportunity. This is an inflection point for us to think differently about how we wrap our arms around our unhoused siblings in the spirit of humanity, not in the spirit of invisibilizing the people who do look like me in this room. So thank you.
Questions. It's 8:30. I want to acknowledge it's 8:30, but last two questions and then we'll wrap up.
Last one. I got mine answered.
You got yours answered. Last question, and then we'll.
I'm Bill Kelleher. First, I guess I'd like to say to this lady that public funding of elections might be the best solution to the problem that you were talking about, and there's probably not a lot of organized movement in that direction, but that's what I would look into. The other thing I wondered about was. I don't know, maybe it's kind of a philosophical question, but whether you call it public housing or social housing, isn't there a risk that you're going to create a permanent class of people who are dependent on government housing?
So that's a great take. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, actually, social housing is not government housing, and it's actually ownership. It actually encourages community ownership and resident ownership of that housing. So if I were to clarify a little bit further, the best way to perhaps think about this is a mobile home park. The mobile home park is often owned by the mobile home landlord. They own the whole park. And then you have individual families who then own the mobile home trailers or homes in the park, or are renting the trailers. Now, I could go into the details about how corporate landlords are taking over that as well, but I won't right now. But just to give you a sense of that's what we're talking about. So actually, the beauty of social housing models is that, and we have them actually across LA, we have them, and Measure ULA that we passed 2 years ago, that we need to continue defending, by the way, because our corporate landlord lobbyists keep trying to take it away from us. But that actually helps fund social housing here in our city. So we have actual models of social housing. And again, I want to recommend you go pick up that pamphlet over there, one of those reports, because you can see pictures of how beautiful they are. And that architecture is actually extraordinarily important for people to feel proud of where they live. But they actually own those buildings. They actually participate, and they can pass it on to their grandchildren. They can pass it on to their family members. And it's very popular in other countries. So I just want to help you understand that it is not reliance on somebody else. This is actual community ownership, community management, community agency. And that is the beauty of this model and the power of it. So, yeah.
So, and there are many variations on this. My wife and I live in what was formerly a cooperative in Los Angeles in Silver Lake, a 10-unit complex. It was a group of union organizers in Los Angeles who put their money together, pooled their money, bought a piece of land, and built 10 houses for themselves. Right, hired the architect, Gregory Ain, and continues to this day. And I think the model there's so many variations on that model. That's kind of it was a cooperative and now it's a condominium, and all that sort of thing. It evolves, but there are so many different ways of creating that kind of social housing that I think is important for us to be looking at, so that we can move away from the default, single family model that has really been so destructive for our social fabric and our environment.
I don't know if, oh yeah, this is still working. Yeah, I think one thing I would add too is just, when we think about what we invest in now, right now the United States invests more in subsidies for wealthy homeowners than we do in subsidies for folks in low-income brackets. And so, I think that we need to acknowledge that there are folks who are going to be outside the workforce. I have, for example, clients who are, have serious disabilities, whether that's physical disabilities, mental health disabilities. Right now we have programs like SSI that are just, that are permanent subsidies, but they're not enough to afford housing, right? And so when we see countries like, for example, Finland that have, effectively ended houselessness, it is with those kind of permanent subsidies that everyone is entitled to by virtue of being, a resident. And Cuba. And Cuba, and for domestic, if we want to look domestically, veteran houselessness, we've applied housing first principles and some rapid rehousing to, but that it works, and we know it works, and we just need to scale it.
Thank you. So,
Sorry, I was going to mention one more thing.
okay.
I would be remiss not to mention our 1 Million Homes campaign. If you want to learn more about it, it's 1millionhomesca.org. But it is a campaign to raise up the understanding education that currently our state government has allocated less than 1% of our housing state budget goes to housing and homelessness in the state. That is an egregious number. 6 times that number goes to state prisons. My friend jokes that our public housing, actually our best public housing in California is our state prisons, and speaks to exactly all the things we've been talking about today. And so it is the awareness that our state actually put out a plan in 2022 of how many units of affordable housing we actually need to build by 2030 to end our affordable housing crisis. So we know the number. It's not some sort of ghoul or ghost. We know exactly what we need to do. We just need to do it. And what that means is getting the public investment and revenue to win that. And so if you want to sign on and join us in that fight, that's the 1 Million Homes campaign. We are carrying it forward until we get that 1 million homes.
Thank you. Okay, so it'll be a quick wrap up. And because this is what you have to do, it's such deep thinking when you try to wrap your brain around all the components of what has resulted in the housing crisis that we're facing. The last remarks from our panelists are going to be a recommendation for a podcast, a documentary, a movie. So if you were to recommend one book, one documentary, one movie, what would you recommend?
I didn't realize it had to be one. Okay, so one that Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. I just finished that. That was very good, about income inequality, which is essential to this discussion. Poverty by America. Also, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And, Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
Oh, you got 3, right? I actually brought some. I thought we were supposed to lay them out on a table, but Richard Rothstein's is right here. That's really important. But this one, I don't know if you see Heather McGee's, The Sum of Us, because I think it's really about creating neighborhoods and community and creating some civic interdependency. That's the key thing that makes all this work. And I think it would wrap all of our conversations together. I think advocating for vibrant neighborhoods as opposed to housing starts to shift that narrative right off the bat into something that nobody can deny, right?
Modern Housing for America by GAIL RADFORD. So I highly recommend that book.
I'll just recommend a podcast. So there's a podcast called Homeland that's coming out where almost 100 people in Los Angeles, across the country, were interviewed on how they're helping to solve it in homelessness. But it's centered in Los Angeles. So you're gonna hear the folks on the front lines talking about what they're doing to address this issue. An amazing person, Ben Kay, actually is the curator, and I believe it comes out sometime next week. So Homeland, which will be really exciting. And I'll just say my favorite quote is from Fannie Lou Hamer. Rae reminded me, and thinking about that, I believe it was her birthday yesterday. But she says that nobody's free until everybody's free. So, man, we be free together in this housing fight. Thank you. Let's also thank our amazing moderator, Sara, for holding us down.
Thank you. We have to thank Jody Armour again. You're so gracious for opening your home to us. Thank you. The ACLU and all of our panelists. So thank you for this wonderful discussion, everybody.